Welcome to Serendipity Wines Icon Series. We're proud to share interviews of some of the most influential personalities in the wine business. We will showcase the people who have made history or are making historic strides into our future reverence. It's our aim at Serendipity Wines to give you a glimpse behind the scenes. Cheers. Good afternoon. I'm Daniel McKeever, and welcome to Serendipity Wines Icon Series. Now, first things first, let's make sure that everyone's on mute and that you have your cameras on, as this will provide energy to our presenters today. So you should have received the wine for today's program along with the price list and library offerings. There should be 7 tasting bottles as such, 2 white and 5 red. I'd recommend that you have 2 wine glasses handy, as we're going to start with white, we'll go back to red, and then back to white, and so forth. Each of our guests today will have 15 minutes for their presentation. At the end of the program, we'll have a question and answer segment. If you have a question along the way, feel free to type it into the chat and we'll address it at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to ask everyone to grab the bottle of Mary Edwards Sauvignon Blanc and go ahead and pour your first taste. It's the one with the mostly naked women on it. And our first guests today are the women of Mary Edwards, who are continuing the legacy of the iconic winery that Mary built. There are very few people who have had clones named after them. In the ways of Pinot Noir, I can think of Swan, Calera, and Meredith. That's some pretty rarefied air. In fact, the last wine that we'll taste from Mary Edwards today is from the single vineyard Meredith estate that I believe is 100% Meredith clone. That in itself is iconic. If that isn't iconic, I don't know what else is. So would you please welcome Nicole Carter and Heidi von der Mehden.
Thank you, everybody, for spending some time with us this afternoon. As Daniel said, my name is Nicole Carter. I have the great fortune of being the president of Mary Edwards Winery, and I'm joined by Heidi von der Mehden, who is our winemaker. I'm going to spend about 5 minutes just giving you, sort of the general history and the lay of the land of Mary Edwards. And then everybody's always anxious to get to the winemaker, not to the executive. So I'll turn it over to Heidi and let her take you through the wines. As Daniel said, a pretty iconic winery and a pretty special place to be in the Russian River. So our winery, if you're not familiar with Mary Edwards, is located in the town of Sebastopol. We're about, as the crow flies, maybe 7 miles from the Pacific Ocean. So we benefit greatly from maritime influence, not only at the winery, but throughout all of our vineyards. We own and farm about 80 acres in the Russian River. So we are dedicated to the Russian River. Everything we do is Russian River with the exception of one wine. And we're going to taste that wine today, which is Sonoma Coast. And really our story begins with Mary herself. If you're not familiar with Mary Edwards, the person, somebody who has really paved quite a path for women in the wine industry. She was among some of the first women to graduate from Davis in the winemaking program and made her career beginnings in the 70s at Mount Eden Winery, which is where it really started for her, and her interest in Pinot Noir and her interest in clonal material all started at Mount Eden. From there, she sort of made her way up the coast and landed in Sonoma County, and is known for starting programs such as Matanzas Creek and Laurier and a lot of other wineries that have gone on to great fame in the Sonoma County area. She became really interested in the Russian River and wanted to dedicate her career to Pinot Noir and some of the great vineyards and terroirs of the Russian River. So today, the Mary Edwards Winery is focused on single vineyard designation of Pinot Noir. And then we have this fan favorite Sauvignon Blanc, which I'll let Heidi tell you the story about. We have 8 single vineyard Pinot Noirs that come from the winery, and then 2 appellation wines, a Russian River and a Sonoma Coast, which are the wines we're going to taste today. And we make about 25,000 cases in total, more than half of which is Pinot Noir, and then the remainder is Sauvignon Blanc. The clone story for Mary. Mary got really interested in clonal material at Mount Eden, as I said earlier, and took some Pinot Noir to Davis to be heat treated and cleaned up. And what came of that was a clone called UCD 37. And that happened in the very early 80s. And it began to gain some popularity with growers in the Russian River and Sonoma County area. But Mary never had a chance to plant it, which is the interesting part of the story. And when she saved up enough money to buy her first vineyard, which wasn't until 1997, which is the Meredith Vineyard and our flagship estate, was the first time she had the opportunity to plant the clone. So she contacted the nursery to buy some, and they said, "I'm sorry, we're sold out of UCD 37." And she said, "Well, I'm Mary Edwards." And they said, "Hold, please." And they came back to her and said, we found some material for you. And she was able to plant just a handful of rows. Today, fast forward, many of our Pinot Noir vineyards are planted to UCD 37. We find that it does particularly well, not only in the Russian River, but for our style of Pinot Noir, which is a bigger, richer, more robust Pinot Noir, as we'll taste today. And many of our neighbor growers and even some of the growers we purchase from now use that material. So Heidi and I are super fortunate to be there. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Heidi, and then she's going to get to the wines. Heidi was hired by Mary in 2015 from Arrowwood Vineyards, and Mary was very interested in thinking about how she was going to succession plan for herself. And bringing someone on board who actually didn't have Pinot Noir experience. So Heidi was trained as a Cabernet winemaker, spent most of her career making Cabernet, and Mary thought that was absolutely ideal. And so that she could shape and mold her to make her style of Pinot Noir. So we consider Heidi to have apprenticed with Mary for quite a few years. And in 2018 is the first vintage where Mary stepped back and let Heidi run the show. So the wines that you have in your glass are what we consider to be Heidi's first vintage as chief winemaker. And we think that the legacy has continued with great consistency. Then in 2018, late 2018, Mary started to think about her own retirement and started to seek out someone to acquire her business because she didn't have an heir that wanted to take on the business. She is a champagne freak at heart. She has always made sparkling wine, if you didn't know that on the side. And when the idea came that she could sell the business to Champagne Louis Roederer, it was a match made in heaven for her. So in 2019, February, Maison Louis Roederer acquired the property, acquired the brand, brought me on, and Heidi agreed to stay. And Mary has since retired. So our connection with her is a little bit more than in spirit. We manage and farm her home ranch where she lives, and that's also part of our stable of vineyards. So we're still strongly connected to her. So with that, you've got a Sauvignon Blanc in your glass. I'm going to turn it over to Heidi. She's going to take us through the wines, and hopefully we'll have some questions from you at the end.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you everybody for joining us on this. So yes, bring out your Sauvignon Blanc. This is the famous somewhat naked lady label that everybody loves, the dancing ladies. It's interesting to have the Sauvignon Blanc in our lineup. Originally, Mary did not want to make Sauvignon Blanc. She didn't want to make white wines. It was going to be 100% Pinot Noir at our winery, passion for Pinot. But then she realized that when she was traveling and doing winemaker dinners, it was nice to have a white wine to offer customers, and it was just something missing. And her sister always loved the Sauvignon Blanc that Mary had made when she was at Matanzas Creek back in the 80s. And so her sister suggested she revitalize that winemaking style. Our Sauvignon Blanc is quite distinct. And it's that way because Mary did not like Sauvignon Blanc. So when she first was making a Sauvignon Blanc, she wanted to find a way to make it a wine that she enjoyed. So we barrel ferment our Sauvignon Blanc 100%. We stir the lees for 5 months, twice a week. We do farming out in the vineyard that promotes a more tropical fruit driven and rich, lush style. So all of that comes together to make a very lush, rich, and still inviting and crisp and yummy Sauvignon Blanc. The 2018 vintage is really special to us because we've been trying to go 100% estate fruit for many years. But that takes a lot of time and money to buy vineyards and plant them and develop them. So in 2015, Mary started to develop some Sauvignon Blanc vineyards for the first time for ourselves in the Russian River Valley. And the 2018 vintage is the first vintage where the majority of the fruit that went into this is actually from our own planted vineyards. We planted them to 1/3 Sauvignon Muscat clone, which is a very aromatic clone. It's the clone that the name evokes what you would think, the muscat aromatics. And 2/3 to the Shenandoah clone, which is your traditional Sauvignon Blanc clone. We found that that's a really good mix for our style. You get those beautiful aromatics, but also the nice grapefruit and citrus tones from the Shenandoah to marry together. Okay, so the 2018 Russian River should be the first one you taste and pour. Again, it's the 2018 vintage, same vintage as our Sauvignon Blanc. The 2018 was an interesting year. It was a very large vintage for everybody in Sonoma and Napa County, a lot of fruit. And I learned from Mary, though, that you have to make your wine in the vineyard. So we went out there, we saw how much fruit was out there, and we said, well, we just got to stick to our guns. We have to thin it back to our regular protocol. We took off shoulders, we took off clusters off of short shoots, we thinned back the vintage. So we had still our about 3 tons to the acre tonnage in our vineyards. And by doing that, even with a larger vintage, we ended up with this really intense, beautiful Pinot Noir. So it's really, if you stick to your guns, do your farming right, you're going to end up kind of evening out those vintages, and you get slight vintage variations, but you still end up with a beautiful wine every year. The 2018 is a really lush, yummy Pinot. It has the classic cherry fruit of the Russian River Valley and big, lush, inviting tannins. And then our last Pinot Noir, I want to make sure I get this one in, is the 2017 Meredith. So this is not 100% UCD37 Mary's clone, but it is a lot of Mary's clone because we've planted more of UCD37 at our Meredith Estate Vineyard since Mary was first able to get those handful of rows. We grafted over a few vineyard rows. That always ends up being one of our best blocks within the vineyard. And then we also planted a couple extra blocks of the UCD37. So we have plenty of that clone and also some 667 planted there that usually gets blended in with the UCD37 to get really nice dark fruit, intense flavors. But then the UCD37 gives it the structure and that deep, rich, dark color that we're always looking for in our Pinot. Mary was very concerned about color with our Pinot Noirs because she always said, well, the first thing you do is you look at what's in the glass. And if it doesn't look inviting, you're going to already think, is it really going to be that great of a wine? So we've always been focused on colors. And with the UCD37, we have really tiny berries, which give a good skin to pulp ratio for dark, intense color. And 667 is similar. The Meredith Estate is in the southwestern portion of the Russian River Valley, and it's very close to the ocean. Has really nice cool breezes. The breeze I'm having right here today is because of crazy windstorms. It's usually not this windy out here, but we usually have very nice cool breezes to really monitor and measure the temperature in the Russian River Valley, especially at Meredith. And you end up having really intense ripe flavors, but also holding on to the acidity naturally. So you get a nice balance and a really nice ageable wine. We have vineyards throughout the entire Russian River Valley. We're able to make wines with different areas, which give different flavors throughout the Russian River Valley. So it really is fun and exciting to present these and work with all these vineyards.
Thank you so very much. All right, everybody, I have an admission to make. Chardonnay is my favorite grape. There, I said it. If you come up to me and you say, this is 100% old Winty clone, barrel fermented, full mallow, minimally stirring, I'm doing a kind of inner childlike happy dance before I even taste the wine. I just learned the other day that anyone who makes Chardonnay that's labeled Hudson Vineyard, and it's quite an impressive list, is 100% Winty clone. Lee Hudson has created one of the greatest vineyards for Chardonnay in the world, but he doesn't just farm Chardonnay. There are many other varieties, including Merlot and Cabernet Franc. I would like to introduce you to Lee Hudson and Skip Karabian.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Skip is with us as well. Skip works with Hudson in regards to sales and management of communications with people. And so Skip, chime in if there's anything I miss as I go. So Daniel, as you said, I'm Lee Hudson. I founded Hudson Vineyards in 1981. And since the inception, I've planted 200 acres of grapes and farm a ranch that's 2,000 acres in southern Napa County, on the county line, almost a Sonoman, within 100 feet of the county line. So I appreciate the presentation from my neighbors in Sonoma, and I really appreciate their focus on vineyards, because as they stated so well, it really is made in the vineyard. I consider myself a wine grower rather than a winemaker, though winemaking is my background. A little bit about my background: born and raised in Houston, Texas. Came to University of Arizona, studied horticulture as an undergrad, and then moved on to Burgundy, where I worked in 1975 and 76 for Domaine du Jacques, which really was a transformative and emboldening kind of experience at 22. Came back to Davis, studied viticulture and enology with a great group of people right after Mary Edwards. And I graduated, went to Oregon, kind of tracing the Pinot Noir dream. Was disenchanted with Oregon in the late 70s and returned back to California, bought my ranch in 1981 and started planting. So today there's 200 acres of grapes and 15 different varieties. Hudson produces about 5,000 cases of wine for ourselves. So about 20% of the vineyard is used for us, and the remainder is sold to other winemakers in the North Coast. Really fortunate to work with some really great, to use the word iconic winemakers. John Consgard, who is our consulting winemaker as well. Steve Kistler, today it's Jason Kesner, who used to work for me, and Mark Aubert, who's a great pleasure to work with those three individuals in vineyard designated Chardonnay. Daniel, as you mentioned, clonal material at Hudson has always been a focus. Since the mid 80s, I traveled throughout California, going into historic vineyards that winemakers and other wine growers mentioned made great wine, selected out selections and brought them back to Hudson and planted them into separate vineyards. Today, there's 54 vineyards on the property. and we grow 14 different selections of Chardonnay, all sourced from either European sources or California sources. But as Daniel said, the Hudson Vineyard designated wines are all made from heritage selections, referred to as Winty, though their origins could be Mount Eden, they could be Hanzel, they could be sources from Larry Hyde or the Kistler Vineyards, or the vineyards in the Russian River Valley. So it's essential to our winemaking style that we use these selections because they're low yielding, high concentration, and early maturing with very small berries. Chardonnay can be made from a kind of from a bold, more oxidative style like our style is, or it can be made very lean. The Shot Winty selections really lend themselves to robust flavors. They're very mineral driven to start with. Then our wine is it's 14 months and 60% new oak, and it is sorely and stirred during its élevage until the very end, where it's settled and assembled into this wine that we have in front of us. The 2018 Hudson Chardonnay. We make 4 different Chardonnays, 3 vineyard designated Chardonnays from the ranch, and then our estate barrel selection that is what we're tasting today. It's an assemblage of 5 different vineyards on the property, and barrel fermented, and it's stirred throughout its entire élevage. It's rich, bold, but it's also got great musculature, which I think is essential to great Chardonnay of this style. It has great acidity, and it's just rich and well structured. The second wine is the Phoenix, which is named after the fire of 2017, which was so devastating to our ranch. And I thought that it was appropriate that we name a wine from coming from the ashes of a very demanding vintage. The Phoenix is 60% Merlot and 40% Cabernet Franc, from 4 different vineyards on the property. Again, an estate barrel selection. We make 2 other red wines that are vineyard designated reds that are Cabernet Franc driven and Merlot driven, but this is 60% Merlot and 40% Cabernet Franc. So very much like a right bank blend from Saint-Emilion or Pomerol. That's the inspiration of this wine. It is 2 years in barrel, 80% new barrels, and it is blended at the very end to make, we think, a very beautifully structured Bordelais style wine that is more European in style, in our opinion, than a bold and kind of more the classic Napa wine that would be jammier. We appreciate wines that have finesse and elegance rather than bold, jammy characters.
Awesomely, thank you so very much. Our final guests today. So some of you might be old enough to remember the great wines from Beringer's Private Reserve in the 90s. Yeah, that's a real thing. I mean, Beringer made great wines back then, and some of the best that Napa had to offer. The Kapcsandy family bought that 20-acre vineyard and turned that hallowed ground into a cult. Now, as far as winemaking goes, I don't know of anyone else who went to work for a vineyard and their first vintage had 2 100-point wines. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and a privilege to introduce Louis Kapcsandy Jr. and Tony Arcudi.
So I will just run through a little bit of the history of Kapcsandy Family Winery for you all, a project that I started with my father 21 years ago. We were looking, I was born and raised in Seattle, Washington, but my father met my mother several years prior to in Northern California. And they used to come up to beautiful Napa Valley, and they would do some riddling with Hans Cornell, and they would see Joe Heitz and Bob Mondavi and all these people when they were dating before they got married. And they always had this kind of, the French call it a coup de cœur. It's sort of a heartstring for Napa Valley. And when my father was getting ready to retire from 30 years in the general contracting construction business, he phoned me up one day. I had left Seattle and I was living in Southern California. He said, "How you doing, son? Are you happy?" I said, "I'm doing fine." He said, "Well, I've got a little something I want to run by you." So long story short, we started looking for property in Napa and Sonoma, something modest. The original idea was about 5 acres of vines and maybe a little homestead that my parents could retire in. And we ended up with a 20-acre parcel that had previously been farmed by Beringer. 15 acres planted. And when I saw the property in January of 2000, all I saw was a gigantic piece of muddy dirt because it was raining on that particular day, and they had ripped out the vines after the 99 harvest and were going to replant it in the 2000 vintage. Beringer never owned the property. They were leasing a portion of it, and they were paying the couple that owned it a fee. And again, kind of to fast forward, we were able to convince the couple that we were the right family to sell their property to, and so they did in May of that year of 2000. We had the opportunity to continue with Beringer, but our idea was not to be grape growers, it was to be winemakers and producers of a very high caliber wine, predominantly Cabernet. We did not know what else because it was our first venture into doing this. So of course we started picking up the phone and talking with all sorts of folks, from Mia Klein to Marco DiGiulio, and the list goes on and on and on. And some people spoke upon our behalf. And within about 6 months after we purchased the property, we were talking with Helen Turley and her husband, John. And Helen and John signed on with us. They helped us lay out and plant the vineyard in 2002 to Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot and Cabernet Franc. And again, 20-acre parcel, 15 of it planted. And they were on board with us for a couple years. They made our first 2 vintages. We made a change from Helen in 2005. We brought on one of her proteges, a guy named Rob Lawson, who studied at Fresno State. And we coupled him with a gentleman that we found through friends of ours in Bordeaux, France. His name is Denny Malbec. And those 2 gentlemen made our 2005, 6, and 7 vintages. We knew we had to pick our horse at one point, so we decided to go with Denny. For those of you that may or may not know some of Denny's history, he was literally born at Chateau Latour in 1969 when his father was then the cellar master of Chateau Latour, and he took over for his father in 1994. There was a big shakeup. He came here and started working with Peter Mondavi Sr. and Jr. at Charles Krug in 2000, and then he came on board with us in 2005. He made about 2 vintages with us, and then fast forward to 2016, and the gentleman sitting to my right, Tony Arcudi, is now making the wines for us. We are still planted Cabernet Sauvignon, significantly more Cabernet Sauvignon than was originally planted. We're now almost 75% Cabernet Sauvignon, and that's due to following how the vineyard has reacted. We originally had 5 modest plots of Merlot, and we now have 2 plots of Merlot that are in the heaviest clay content soils, which is an adobe clay that is very, very rare in the valley. And it's only very close to the river on the valley floor in certain sections of Yountville and to the north and the south of us. And we have done, we've looked at the soils, and we've talked to people that we know in Pomerol, and there are certain criteria in terms of the elements in the clay that are quite similar to the plateau of Pomerol, which is where, of course, the great Merlots of Bordeaux are grown. We are known for predominantly 3 red wines, of which can be blends or they can be 100% varietals. The 2 wines we're going to taste today, the first one is a blend, which is our 2017 Estate Cuvée. It's predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon with an 8% addition of Merlot and 3% Petit Verdot. The first year we made this wine was in 2005 when Helen Turley was making our wines. She had the idea to make one singular wine, and when we made a change from her, we started to call out some of the lots, and we clearly had better lots, and we had some, I wouldn't call them mediocre, they just weren't knock your socks off blocks. And we have worked very, very hard to bring everything up in balance, which we're making better and better wine each and every year. And of course, a lot of that has to do with how we treat the vineyard. The Estate Cuvée for me is a wine that should be immediately enjoyable. We make all of our wines to age, but this is a wine, this is a product that really for me is the vanguard. So it's kind of the approaching leader of any vintage that we release. And it's the wine that I encourage people to pop and pour and enjoy, to be reminded of what we're doing here. And it's kind of a little bit of a hallmark of the vintage, because what we do is, as our previous presenters have talked about, all the attention to detail that goes into the vineyard. There are all these different phrases and sayings, and one of the ones that I like is that there's no greater substitute than the winemaker or the vintner's footprint in the soil of the vineyard. So that means you must be out there, you must be paying attention and looking constantly. And the two of us are in a fortunate position where we're dealing with 15 acres. We're not dealing with 1,500. So, you know, it's the scale that we're dealing with. Everything, all of our wines are 100% estate from this parcel, one contiguous parcel. And I believe that we're able to craft significantly different wines within the vintage that all are standalone, excellent to exceptional wines, whether they be Cabernet based, whether they be Merlot based, whether they're a blend. The idea here is to be as transparent as possible and to let the vineyard be our guide. Another old phrase that I love is that you never really look at the fruit on the ground. You look at what's left over on the vine. And the whole idea is to get proper sunlight, proper solar radiation, proper wind through the vine, so that you can basically ripen as best you can at the appropriate trajectory to give you the opportunity to make world-class wine. And everything that we do here is based upon that. And that's been the motto and the mantra since day one. And I believe that we are beyond fortunate and blessed to have a property such as we have, which is a relatively flat piece of property. There's only a 12-foot elevational change. We went through great lengths to lay out the vineyard in the proper row orientation so that the vineyard could survive as long as possible. If we get 40 or 50 years out of these vines, I'm going to be quite happy. Of course, we could get more, but then, you know, your production falls and, you know, they become heritage blocks and all that kind of idea. But really, besides balance, what we want is we have sort of one foot or one hand in Bordeaux and one in Napa. So we never want to try to make something like they make in Bordeaux, but we are inspired by the elegance, the balance, the freshness of the best of Bordeaux and also the best of Napa, but we also have the power and the ripeness. And when I talk about ripeness, I primarily am talking about tannins, because we are fortunate in Napa Valley and Sonoma, to a lesser extent, that we don't lack for sugars. So we're always looking for phenolics. And that is the real challenge. But if you pay attention, you have a good site, and you take beautiful care of your vines, then you have every opportunity to make wines that are can not only be enjoyed relatively soon when they're young, relatively soon after they've been bottled. They can age for a long time, but they can be absolutely transcendent and show-stopping wines, and that's essentially what we're trying to do here. I'll let my winemaker Tony talk a little bit about the 2016 Roberta's Reserve, which is 100% varietal. That we are starting to produce this wine as more of a pure varietal, based upon the age of the vines and based upon what we're looking for. We're able to get it as a pure varietal. Tony?
So has everybody had the estate cuvee and is now onto the Roberta's? So yeah, I came on board in 2016, and sometimes it's good to be lucky. That's a fantastic vintage here in Napa. The reason it's so good is we had a mild August. I don't mean a day or a weekend. The whole month of August was mild, which is not typical here in Napa. So what that did was it allowed the phenolics to really have time to develop. And we were just patient, and Mother Nature worked with us and brought about very developed phenolics, very developed tannins. And this particular part of the vineyard that Louis was talking about, it's really heavy clay soils. It's down by the river. And that just produces a Merlot with quite a bit of power. It's a very substantial Merlot. It's not your grandmother's Merlot at all. And it's quite substantive. And it's really gotten a following. So this vintage is 100% Merlot. And as Louis was talking about, these vines are getting really mature in age. So they're able to handle the stress very well. In 2017, we had a heat wave around Labor Day, and these vines didn't skip a beat. I mean, you couldn't even tell. I mean, it was over 100 degrees and so on, and there was absolutely no effect on these vines. So the vines are mature, it handles the stress and produces these grapes that are just, they're just beautiful. So I'm very fortunate to be working with this property.
Looks like there's a question in the chat room about what's the age of the Merlot vines.
They are 18 years old.
We did have a question in the chat earlier to Heidi and Nicole. Are we looking at possibly taking sparkling a little bit more broad market? I know we've made it in the past and I love it.
We're definitely still making sparkling. I don't know if it's going to go broad market. We have a few here in the cellar, Entourage. And right now we're looking at doing some dosage trials later on this year on our 2013 sparkling wine. But you know, the nice thing is in the past, I've always done my sparkling. Mary taught me to do it here in-house. So we were doing it it was like a little garage operation. I have a little 6-spout filler, and we'd sit there and put the bottles and fill them up that way. And we have a little crown capper that you press 2 buttons and you crown cap it. So it was a big deal. We had a little production line going out here in the cellar all day long. Now I'm really a little relieved to know that I have the expertise plus a little bit more professional equipment up at Rotor that I could use for future sparkling wines that we might decide to make. We'll see.
Question for Lee. If I'm going back to the chat room, Daniel, if you may, if you allow me, I'm just gonna look and said that was asking about the 2-year barrel. If there was influence from Consgard to do 2 years in barrel. I believe this was in reference to the Phoenix.
John Consgard's been a tremendous influence on our wine style. John and I went to Davis together in '77, and he is today an important buyer of ours from both Syrah and Chardonnay. And when I decided to start making wine in 2004, I asked him to come on as kind of my consigliere rather than a consulting winemaker. His Chardonnay winemaking style is very much ours in that it is, I would call it more of an oxidative form of Chardonnay, which means that we don't purposely expose it to oxygen, but we don't protect it. And so the 2 years in barrel for our Chardonnay is what the kind of the exceptional component of our Chardonnay is definitely comes from his influence. So I was asked the other day why we spend 2 years in barrel and Chardonnay, and it's kind of counterintuitive. The longer it stays in oak, the less oaky it is. The assimilation of the oak regime is really enhanced by time in barrel. So both for our white wine and our red wine were 22 months or 23 months in barrel. But the more unusual one is with the Chardonnay, where we don't sulfur the wine until its second March, and then assemble and bottle in July of the second July.
Lee, I've got another one for you. So your Napa side of Carneros, when did you decide to move away from Pinot Noir?
Well, when we started planting in 1981, there was 200 acres of grapes in Carneros. It was mostly dairies, and the dairies succumbed to. We're moving to the Central Valley or out to the further out west, and vineyards were coming in, and the majority of the vineyards were Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. My first plantings were Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and by 2000, Tony Soder from Etude bought 100% of our Pinot Noir. He sold to Behringer in 2001. I could never, as an independent grower, make money in Pinot Noir because the yields were too low and the price was too low. And so, and most of the Pinot Noir buyers were moving west and out of Napa. And we were getting far more demand for Chardonnay and Merlot and Cabernet Franc. And so we slowly but surely, 2016 was our last sale of Pinot Noir. And since then, we have no acreage in Pinot Noir today. Beautiful variety, love the grape. And we made really great Pinot Noir from our site. I don't think it was a question of not making great Pinot Noir. It's just that we didn't have the demand for it. And so we moved away from it.
Looking at the pre-sale page, I see Estate Cuvée Cabernet and then Estate Cuvée 2011. Might you talk a little bit about the 2011? I see a 95 plus from Galloni and also a great price tag on it.
The vineyard was originally planted 2/3 Merlot, and now it's only about 22% Merlot. So it's based upon the cepage of the planting. That's the 2011. And for me, the 2011 Estate Cuvée, and this is not just a sales pitch. I mean, it's really singing. We're on a 10-year anniversary, and there's nothing nervy or edgy about it. It's completely silky and right in the pocket. And now's the time to enjoy it. Now's the time to drink it and sell
it. I think a lot of critics kind of didn't speak well of the 2011 vintage. It was a difficult vintage. But that being said, there were some great producers who created some great wine. If you were around for the second icon thing that we did, he was speaking about the fact that that 2011 was one of his favorite vintages because it was so hard to make, and maybe that has a little something to do with the price, and still has the great scores.
One of the funny things about 2011 was that it was relatively warm up until the beginning of June. So we had excellent bud break, incredible set. So it was looking like a very large crop for just about everybody. And then it cooled off. And a lot of people don't know this, but on the valley floor in Napa Valley in 2011, the soil temperatures were 10 to 12 degrees lower throughout the entire summer than is normal or average. And then, of course, we had the rain, so you had to make your selections. And we ended up leaving close to 50% of the Cabernet out in the field because it was going to rot. You can't bring that stuff into the barn.
But you're right. The good producers just made less wine to maintain quality, a lot less wine. So there's just more selection, more dropping of fruit in 2011. But there's plenty of good wines out there. You just have to find them.
The people that panicked and picked a little bit early weren't able to get the tannins right. And we went the other way, and we just waited and waited and waited. Part of it I call our Chem vintage because we made about 5 passes in a few blocks. So it was drop some fruit 3 days later, drop some more, 3 days later, drop some more. So just wait and wait until your tannins are right, if you can.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. I do want to mention that many of the wines have very limited quantities available, particularly from the libraries. All of you on the call have first dibs, so on claiming some of these iconic wines. I want to thank all of our guests, and I'd like to say on behalf of Serendipity Wines, thank you all for joining us, and thank you for doing what you do. Stay safe and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to everybody. Thank you to all the buyers and the support. Stay safe.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Super pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
Cheers.